Hello you, it's me. Today we're going to talk about The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, book 1 in the Era 1 Mistborn trilogy, and the third Sanderson book I have ever read. Make sure you check out my other reviews so far for Elantris and Warbreaker. This is the March pick for our Cosmere 1-a-month crab-along. I'll link the Discord down below. Come chat with us about Cosmere stuff. It's pretty cool. So there will be, as usual, the plot, stuff I liked, stuff I didn't like, and then theories, questions I still have that are, as of yet, unanswered at the end. I don't want spoilers though. I'm keeping you posted on my thoughts and feelings. Time's in the time bar. In the Final Empire, the population is separated into the nobles, which means exactly what you think it means, and the Scar. People who are pretty much born into and die in slavery, unable to break free of the restrictions and constraints of their caste. The land is overseen by the Lord Ruler, a supposedly immortal being that vanquished a terrible darkness a long time ago. He uses his troops and guilds to keep this system in place throughout the land, and may or may not be a fragment or a shard of a godlike being. Sometimes among the noble classes, allomancy awakens. This gives a person the ability to ingest and burn a specific metal to give themselves temporary metal-specific abilities. 99% of allomancers only have the ability to burn one metal. Soothers burn brass to influence the emotions of others. Coin shots burn steel to repel metal objects, many others. There are 8 normal metals, some special ones as well. When a noble has a child with a scar that isn't immediately killed to prevent this kind of thing, the child also has the potential for the allomancy ability to awaken in them. Vin is such a child, an allomancer scar, but she's Mistborn with the ability to burn all metals and use all of their abilities. She works untrained in her magic for a gang of thieves in Luthadel, the country's capital, and is noticed by another Mistborn, Kelsier, who enlists her in his personal fight to avenge his family, liberate the Scar, overthrow the Final Empire, and kill the Lord Ruler. Firstly, I want to say that this reads so differently than the other 2 Sanderson books I've read so far. I think there are a few things that lend to that difference, but the key one I think is that there is less jumping around. While you do have chapters with some specific point of view, for the most part you're following the same storyline with a large cast sort of dipping in and out. It's not like Warbreaker, it's not like Elantris, where you have these very insular timelines that converge at the end. It's a much faster read than the other Sandersons I've read so far. I think that's because, firstly, it's much less politics heavy. This book has more of a plans being drawn around the war table vibe. It does have an aspect of court politics and noble manipulation, but that comes into play a lot later in the book, and it's much less heavy. Secondly, I think it's because there's so much action in this story. There are so many fast-paced action scenes in this book. And yes, I do think that large portions of this book had a bit of a Rocky-esque training montage feel. But honestly, that just got me more invested, seeing the very different teaching methods of people trying to help Vin refine her technique. In terms of action, one place I think this book really shone was in fight scenes. It's hard to write good fight scenes full stop, managing to keep a pace going, knowing when to change direction, when to stop. And it's even harder to do that when you have a magic system to work into it as well, and somehow you have to keep the fights believable and not cringy. And honestly, every single physical conflict segment in this book had me on the edge of my seat, and I loved it. As usual with Sanderson, you have this fantastic secondary world building, which we get in the form of the religions that we're told about by Sazed, and in the form of the journal epigraphs we get at the beginning of each chapter. There's much less of this in Final Empire than in Warbreaker or Elantris, but I feel like that's because this is book 1. How it's ended has really set us up in such a way that I think there'll be a bigger exploration of myth going forward. The foreshadowing in this book is also very different to the foreshadowing in Warbreaker, where you only realise when you got to the end how much was being foreshadowed. In this one, you really notice things the whole way through and you're like, okay, that's not trivial. And you're racking your brains about what's going to happen, how the story elements are going to be resolved, rather than in Warbreaker where you're trying to figure out what the story is and what was actually happening. I think in this one we're presented with a very clear liberate the Scar, topple the Empire motive, and I think everybody's goal is very clear from the off. So the foreshadowing is more for plot points than misdirection. if that makes sense. I really have an appreciation for how low emphasis on romance Sanderson books are so far. For me, it really gives them almost a Studio Ghibli vibe. You also often in films and movies have where a character encounters a romance element and it just derails everything. It makes them put their motivation by the wayside, rethink all their goals. And I'm glad that's not something Sanderson does, especially because all of his books so far either mainly or partially revolve around very strong, fleshed out, well written female characters. And I think something like that wouldn't do them justice. In terms of his characters, I think another place Sanderson shines is how believable they are as people. None of the dialogue feels forced. He's able to write funny lines without being edgy, which I've said before, and maintain is very hard. I think one of the reasons I've not been able to get into much high fantasy before is while there are often big thoughts, shiny world builds, secondary religion, myth, legend, you do often get these two-dimensional, very wooden characters that let the whole thing down. More in fantasy, I find, than in any other genre except for maybe slasher horror. I'm honestly finding it so hard not to binge read this series and actually drag it out to be one a month. It does let us have these amazing discussions about the books though, which I think is so important for books as big and as rich as these. So join our Discord. Again, I'll tell you, link below. But yes, I want to read more. Waiting is hard. Okay, spoilers from here on out. So go and read this book if you haven't read this book. Things I liked. My first point here, I feel like, could actually, for other people, be something that lets the book down. But I loved it. And it's how tropey the characters in the main gang were, and how they all sort of trope fulfilled their roles. You had young person discovering their power, being taught by an older person with a traumatic past. You have big strong boy who can use big strong strength magic, shady quiet person who can use smoke magic, eccentric aloof bard guy who can influence emotions, the stoic who can sense emotions in others. It felt like a very cliche and tropey gang, but they all fit together really well. One thing I liked was that each single metal user, each elementor, may be better at that specific metal than somebody who can use them all. Their mastery of it coming from hard work, a lifetime of practice of honing skill and finesse, and I liked that was touched on with each person's individual interaction with Vin. I love the frickin' monsters in this book. The Kandra, the Mist Wraiths, the foreshadowing for that was so cool. I could see it coming and I was so excited. The idea of something that eats the dead, that incorporates them into their physical being, would be something that's looked upon with fear and disgust, even though really it's part of an ecosystem that prevents the spread of disease. The way they address them in the story I really enjoyed. The image of something flowing towards you like a tidal wave of flesh, inside which you can just see this clicking, rolling mass of bone. Absolutely horrifying. 10 out of 10. I'm interested to know whether this is something that actually keeps the Kandra alive. Do they need to eat dead stuff, or is it just a compulsion or something they like? I also loved the Steel Inquisitors. I think they had a really Clive Barker vibe. I really had this image of them in my head that was probably quite influenced by the Cenobites. I love misdirection. I love when stuff takes me by surprise. I think most of the stuff in this book I did see coming, but it didn't detract from my enjoyment of the book. But, the one bit I didn't see coming was that the person who wrote the journal that we see in the epigraphs was not the current Lord Ruler. And one thing that led to that being a huge piece of misdirection for me is how much Kelsier changes over the course of the book. You have this character starting a revolution from the ground up, sowing seeds of dissent, personally meeting people on the front line, so to speak. By the end of the book, he's sort of directing the movements of armies, leading skirmishes, and, as Vin accuses them all, pretty close to becoming exactly the same as the nobles. His goal seems to get less and less about liberation and more about personal revenge. And I thought this was going to be a parallel that we saw with the Lord Ruler. That caught me off guard, taking that last minute swerve. This is the first book I've read in ages where the main character was my favourite character. I think Vin is such a fantastic lead. Cannot wait to see more of them in the sequels. Especially where they're going to go, where they're going to be steered without somebody to help them develop their power. Things I didn't like. I think the only thing I can really fault this book on is the Heart Eyes for Elend scenes. I think that Vin, having spent her whole life being distrustful and on guard, was far too quick to know in her heart that Elend was a good guy. I feel like that was weirdly out of character for Vin, especially when seeing how manipulative everybody else on the court scene is. I don't know. I feel that I'm not mad that it happened. I'm mad that it happened so quick. I feel like because there are two sequels, that could have been something that was really dragged out to be a bit more slow burn. Didn't feel very organic for me. So, questions I still have that are yet unanswered. I don't actually want the answers to these yet. Also, I know, read and find out. But here's what my questions are so far. How did the rift originally occur between the Scar and the nobles? What caused the disparity, the separation of the classes, the subjugation of a race? I'm hoping we get a proper backstory on that eventually. We've got sort of a look at how the Inquisitors are made, but not how they actually function. But with all the reference to the Ferris men being able to invest characteristics in pieces of metal on their body, like earrings, like bracelets, I feel like the metal spikes must have something to do with that. Ferromancy? Ferrochemy? With the magic system, what's the deal with alloys? Every pure metal burn allows the user to do something, and then when an alloy of that metal is burnt, it allows them to do the opposite thing, basically. Does this mean that all metals in the world have always had magic, or that magic was assigned to the metals after the creation of the alloys by humans, by something incredibly powerful like a god or a set of gods? Why does steel do anything as an alloy? It's not iron and another metal, it's iron and carbon. Why does carbon do anything magic? Hoyd showed up again, causing mischief and trouble. I'm really in two minds about Hoyd. Is he some trickster type, Loki type god figure moving between the worlds, just causing trouble because that's who he is? I'm still not sure if Hoyd's even human. My other thought about Hoyd is that maybe he's a time traveller, trying to guide events to certain conclusions to ensure certain outcomes. But I'm glad he's hanging around. I'm glad he's tying this all together into one universe. I am excited to see more of the Kandra. Being a sentient race eventually at some point in their life cycle, I'm interested to see what kind of society, what kind of societal hierarchy a creature like that would have. Where do they even physically hang out when all the mist is gone, when the humans are awake? Sazed mentions a religion based on colour. Is that somehow tied to Warbreaker? In the epigraphs, they mention a shiny, shimmery lake in the mountains. Is this just a lake, or is this somehow a reference to the lake we saw at the end of Elantris? This one's kind of weird. And I don't know if it's story relevant, going to be addressed later, or if it's Sanderson not understanding how plants work. There's one scene where Kelsia shows Vin a flower or a picture of a flower. She's never seen one because flowers don't grow anymore in this world, because of the ash, because of the mist. But she says it smells like fruit. So she knows what fruit is, she's eaten fruit. You physically can't have fruit without there having been a flower first. That's biology. Like even wheat has flowers. If there are no flowers in this world, how are there any crops at all? How is everybody not starved to death? I also feel like the Lord Ruler was somehow holding back the deepness, and with him gone, it's now going to be released. I like the idea that the hero of ages was probably never him in the first place, that the prophecy still is yet to be fulfilled. It's probably going to be Vin at the end of the trilogy, but we'll find that out. So I'm going to give this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. Cannot wait to read the second one. Say it again, make sure you join our Discord, link down below. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, link down below. Goodreads, link down below. Like and subscribe. More reviews coming thick and fast. Join me on this magical Brandon Sanderson journey. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.